I was only a child, just 9 years old, but I remember 1919 as if it were yesterday, the year everything changed. Berlin, my home, was no longer the grand city I had once known. The sounds of celebration had long faded, replaced by the unsettling echoes of revolution and uncertainty. The Kaiser was gone, abdicated in disgrace, and Germany, a nation that had once stood proud and strong, was now reeling from the consequences of the war. The air was thick with bitterness and fear as the country tried to find its footing again. Before I move on, I want to remind you, if you're enjoying this journey through history, make sure to like and subscribe to my channel. It helps a lot, and I want to share more stories like this with you. It was the year when the unthinkable happened. The Treaty of Versailles was signed, forcing us to accept the blame for the war. It was a bitter pill to swallow. I overheard my parents arguing in the kitchen, their voices trembling with anger. Friedrich Ebert, who had taken control as the leader of the newly formed Weimar Republic, was trying to stabilize the country, but it was clear no one trusted him. People were angry at the loss of the war and humiliated by the terms of the peace treaty. As I walked through the streets of Berlin, I saw soldiers, once the proud defenders of the empire, now wandering aimlessly, their uniforms faded, their eyes hollow. They had no purpose now, nothing to fight for. The political chaos was palpable, and the air was thick with the sounds of Spartacist uprisings and failed revolutions. The Bavarian Soviet Republic had lasted only a short while, and I remember hearing stories from the adults about how it was quickly put down by the Reichswehr. It was all so confusing. Everyone seemed to have their own idea of what Germany should become, but no one knew how to achieve it. The economy, too, was collapsing. Hyperinflation set in by 1923. I'll never forget the sight of people burning piles of banknotes for warmth. I remember my father coming home one evening, his coat pocket stuffed with bills that were utterly worthless. He had been paid in marks, but by the time he reached the market, everything was far too expensive. Wages were paid twice a day, and even then the money would lose its value before it could be spent. I watched as people traded goods in the streets, desperate to get by. Bartering had become the only way to survive. It wasn't uncommon to see someone trading bread for a pair of shoes, or even for something as trivial as a few cigarettes. The desperation was overwhelming. I saw it in the faces of the people who stood in line for hours just to get a loaf of bread. I could feel the tension building, like a storm about to break. The adults argued in hushed voices about the future. I overheard them speaking of General von Seeckt, the head of the Reichswehr, and how he was working to preserve the military power of Germany in the face of political unrest. The streets were full of rumors. Some said the military might take control. Others feared a communist revolution. In the midst of it all, I could only watch, trying to make sense of the madness that was unfolding around me. Even in the midst of the chaos, there were those who clung to hope. They spoke of recovery, of rebuilding, but the shadow of defeat loomed large. I remember the brief moments when things seemed to calm down. There was talk of a new government, a new beginning, but I could feel the war's scars everywhere. The buildings still pockmarked from bombings, the soldiers who walked the streets like ghosts, and the political factions that seemed to grow louder with every passing day. By 1923, it was clear that the Weimar Republic was barely holding on. The beer hall putsch occurred that year, and I remember my father talking about it with dread. Adolf Hitler, a name I would later come to know very well, had tried to seize power in Munich, but the attempt had failed. Even though the Nazi Party was crushed, it was clear that there were forces at play, forces that wanted to see the Weimar Republic fall and bring Germany back to something else, something older. The Republic felt fragile, like it might shatter at any moment. But that year also brought something new, something we would call the Golden Twenties, though the light was dim and its glow only briefly touched our city. The year was 1924, and with the Dawes Plan in place, the economy slowly began to stabilize. The Reichsmark regained some value, and Germany started to see signs of recovery. There were moments of hope in the midst of it all. I remember feeling a strange sense of relief, even as I knew things were far from stable. But it was hard to forget the chaos that had just passed. The economy had been a wreck, but people still tried to find ways to live. The years that followed the chaos of 1919 were a strange mix of hope and dread. The Weimar Republic was fragile, but it began to take its first hesitant steps toward recovery. For the first time in my life, I saw Berlin start to come alive again. The Dawes Plan of 1924 was supposed to bring economic stability, and in a way, it did. The Reichsmark stabilized, and inflation, though still a haunting memory for many, slowed its relentless pace. My family, like many others, was able to breathe again. We even began to see small improvements in our living conditions, though I could still feel the scars of the past beneath it all. As I grew older, I began to see Berlin as a city of contradictions. By day, it was a place of industrial recovery, the factories humming again and the streets bustling with people trying to reclaim the future. But by night, it was a different world, one filled with music, art, and vibrant culture. Jazz filled the air in the cafes and clubs. I remember walking past a club one evening, the sound of Louis Armstrong drifting out, and feeling like I was stepping into a world I had only ever dreamed of. The youth culture in Germany, particularly in Berlin, was exploding. It was the dawn of the Golden Twenties, and there was a sense of freedom, even if it was fleeting. I saw young men and women in flapper dresses and suits, laughing and dancing the night away. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, 1927, was one of the films that embodied that era. I went to see it with my friends, and even though I didn't fully understand everything in the film, there was something magical about the way it portrayed the future, about how it seemed to blend the old with the new in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. We spoke a lot about modernism in school, about artists and architects like Walter Gropius and Paul Klee. Their works of Bauhaus architecture and design were everywhere, and they inspired a new vision for the country. The Bauhaus movement wasn't just about architecture. It was about a new way of thinking, of creating, of living. We were all starting to believe that maybe Germany could find its way again. Maybe we could be more than just the defeated nation of the past. Gustav Stresemann played a key role in all of this. He was the one who led Germany back into the international fold, earning our place in the League of Nations in 1926. His diplomacy seemed to give us all a glimmer of hope, a reminder that Germany wasn't just a nation in ruins, but a country that could once again be taken seriously. I remember hearing adults speak about him with admiration, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the past could be left behind. But as much as I wanted to believe in that hope, I couldn't shake the unease I felt every time I saw those in brown shirts marching through the streets. The NSDAP, led by Adolf Hitler, was growing stronger. I didn't understand everything they were saying, but I knew enough to see that their rhetoric was powerful, dangerous even. There was something in the way they spoke, something that resonated with the anger and frustration people still felt. And as much as Stresemann tried to rebuild Germany's reputation abroad, there was something rotting beneath the surface, something no one wanted to acknowledge. At school, I sat next to Jewish classmates, some of whom I considered friends. We never spoke much about our differences, but I could tell that their presence made some of the other children uncomfortable. I remember my friends whispering about the rise of the Nazi Party and about the Jews, their fear palpable even though it wasn't something openly discussed. It was as though the country was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. And then there were the cafes. I remember walking past them in the evenings, the windows glowing with soft yellow light, and hearing Bertolt Brecht being discussed. His plays were the talk of the town. He had a way of reflecting the frustration and disillusionment of the common people, and though his words were radical, I couldn't help but be drawn to the passion of his ideas. The Weimar Republic was still young, still forming, and people were desperate to rebuild, but there was also a feeling that the world was changing in ways we couldn't control, that everything was fragile, and that the stability we so desperately needed could slip away at any moment. But it wasn't just the political or social landscape that was shifting, it was also personal. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was becoming part of something bigger than myself. I was growing up in the midst of all these changes, unsure of what the future held, but willing to believe that it could be different, that the scars of war might be healed, that we could truly move forward. But all of this hope, all of this potential, would soon be shattered. The crash of 1929 was like a cold wave hitting the warm shores of hope we had built during the golden 20s. One moment it seemed like everything was on the verge of improving, and the next it was all coming undone. I was just starting to understand what it meant to be an adult when the Great Depression arrived, devastating the country. By then, I had my first job. I was a clerk at a small factory in Berlin, one of many who had found work as the economy began to stabilize. It felt like progress, a sign that maybe Germany could rise again. I was young, but I had hopes. I believed the worst was behind us, that our struggles had created enough strength to move forward. But that illusion was shattered when the stock market crash of 1929 hit, and soon after, the depression began to unfold across Germany. Factories started closing. People lost their jobs. The streets, once full of life and energy, grew quieter. I remember walking to work one morning, past familiar faces, and noticing how different everything seemed. There was a sense of panic in the air, something I hadn't felt before. Suddenly, everything seemed fragile. The Reichsmark, which had finally stabilized in 1924, began its slow descent into worthlessness again. The money we had worked so hard to rebuild, to save, was crumbling beneath us. The currency's value had plummeted, and with it, the lives of millions of ordinary Germans. I lost my job soon after the crash, just as my father had. I spent days walking through Berlin trying to find something, anything to keep us afloat. But it was a struggle. The unemployment rate shot up, and I began to see people I knew standing in long lines for bread, for anything they can get their hands on. Those familiar faces were now hard, gaunt, marked by worry. The sense of hope we had clung to was gone, replaced by desperation. I began to notice the changes in Berlin, things I had once ignored or taken for granted. Nazi party rallies became more frequent, their brown-shirted SS stormtroopers marching through the streets, with their uniforms making them impossible to miss. They were everywhere now, in the cafes, in the pubs, on the corners. The speeches they gave were filled with anger, hatred, and the promise of a new Germany, a Germany that would be great again. I could hear the fervor in their voices, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe they could offer something to the people who were struggling like my family. In 1932, I saw Adolf Hitler speak at a rally in the city. The crowd was massive, their eyes fixed on him, hanging on his every word. It wasn't the first time I had heard his name, but something about seeing him in person felt different. His voice was commanding, almost hypnotic. He spoke of the Versailles Treaty, of the Treaty of Saint-Germain, of betrayal and humiliation. He talked about the restoration of German pride, about putting the right people back in charge. His words resonated with me and with so many others. You could feel the energy in the air, the fire in the crowd. There was a sense of unity in that space, but it was the kind of unity born from hatred, from division. I didn't understand everything he was saying, but I felt it. There was a hunger in the crowd for something, anything, that could end the humiliation, that could restore Germany to its former glory. But I couldn't ignore the voices that whispered in the back of my mind, voices that reminded me of the dangers of this kind of fervor. My father, a quiet man, would later say in hushed tones, "It's not just the hunger of the stomach they are feeding, but the hunger of the soul. Be careful." But it wasn't just Hitler and the Nazis who were growing in strength. The communists were also gaining ground. I saw communist protests and rallies, and the tension in the streets only grew. There was a constant undercurrent of fear, of something about to snap. People were ready for change, and they didn't care what kind of change it would be. The political divide deepened. The Social Democrats and the Communists fought against the growing Nazi Party, while the streets filled with blood during clashes between the two factions. The violence and unrest were escalating. I began to see people I had known for years change, becoming radicalized, their once neutral opinions turning into hard lines drawn in the sand. It was no longer about finding solutions. It was about choosing sides. There was no middle ground anymore, not for most people. In the spring of 1932, I went to a local cafe with a few friends. The conversation turned to the elections, to the increasing support for the Nazis. Some of my friends spoke with cynicism, others with hope. It was as if we had all been waiting for something to come and save us, but none of us knew what that something might look like. I overheard a group of older men speaking in hushed voices, some laughing, others angry, about Gustav Stresemann and his efforts to restore Germany's reputation abroad. But the hope for diplomacy seemed faint compared to the rising storm around us. At night, the city seemed to pulse with unease. The streets that had been vibrant with life were now filled with whispers, with people moving quickly to avoid the growing crowds of extremists. There was no place to hide from the political tension in the air. Everyone seemed to have a strong opinion, and those opinions were getting louder, sharper. No one knew what would come next, but we all knew it would be something monumental. The Wall Street crash had struck, and now the world seemed to be spiraling downward. The Weimar Republic was on its last legs, and the rise of radical ideologies, the promise of a strong leader who would bring Germany back to its feet, was gaining traction. It was a time of uncertainty, a time of fear, but it was also a time when Germany, broken and bruised, would have to make a choice. We all felt it, the creeping shadow of what might come next. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know where the country is headed, but I do know that something is about to change, and we are all caught in its pull. We are watching history unfold, and in its unfolding, I feel something stir inside me, a sense of dread, a sense of inevitability. Let's see what tomorrow brings. It happened quickly, almost too quickly to fully comprehend. One moment we were a nation struggling to find its way, lost in the aftermath of a war we had never fully recovered from, and the next, the country was being swept up in a frenzy of power and promise. January 30th, 1933. That was the day Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. That day felt like a moment of reckoning. We had watched his rise from the sidelines, but now he was in power, and there was no turning back. I remember that day vividly, though I didn't understand at the time just how far-reaching the consequences would be. Hitler's appointment was met with a mixture of celebration and concern. For many, it was the end of uncertainty. The Nazi Party, with its promise of national rebirth and pride, had garnered enough support to take control. I saw people cheering in the streets, waving flags with the swastika. It was surreal. It felt like the last desperate breath of a dying country being replaced by something new, something that promised to restore us to greatness. But there was something off about it. There was a sense of unease that followed the celebrations, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. I watched the power shift almost imperceptibly in the weeks following Hitler's rise. There were whispers everywhere. Nazi SA stormtroopers marched through the streets in brown shirts, their boots echoing on the cobblestone as they paraded their power. They were everywhere, on street corners, in public squares, forcing everyone to notice them and forcing anyone who disagreed with them to stay silent. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, made it all feel real, more dangerous. The fire was blamed on the communists, though some of us wondered if it had been staged. Regardless, the aftermath was immediate. The Reichstag fire decree was passed, suspending civil liberties and allowing the government to arrest political opponents without reason. The country seemed to shift overnight into something authoritarian as the last remnants of democracy crumbled. I remember hearing about people being taken away in the middle of the night. Communists, social democrats, even Catholic leaders. Anyone who opposed the new regime was suddenly a target. The speed at which Hitler consolidated power was breathtaking. The Enabling Act, passed on March 23, 1933, gave him the authority to enact laws without the Reichstag's approval.
It was the final blow to any pretense of democracy. Just like that, the Reichstag was effectively sidelined, and Hitler became the lawmaker, the judge, the executor of Germany's future. He wasn't just Chancellor now, he was the very embodiment of power in the country.
I could feel it happening, like a slow but steady erosion of everything that had once defined the country I grew up in. The things we took for granted, freedom of speech, personal liberty, began to fade. It wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like we were all being dragged along, some in support, some in fear, and others just resigned to what was happening. People I knew, some of them my friends, seemed to embrace the changes. They spoke of national pride, of unity, of a Germany that was going to rise from the ashes and reclaim its place on the world stage. But I couldn't ignore the signs. Friends of mine began disappearing. The Jewish shopkeepers who had once greeted me by name with a warm smile now faced harassment. Boycotts started against Jewish businesses, and the streets were filled with the sound of Nazi propaganda. Shops that had once been bustling with customers now stood empty, their windows smashed. One day, I saw the wife of a Jewish neighbor being dragged from their shop, her arms twisted behind her back as soldiers threw her belongings into the street. It was a moment that stuck with me. It wasn't just that these things were happening. It was how easily they seemed to be accepted by those around me. People looked away, or worse, stood by, watching in silence. The Hitler Youth grew stronger, and I saw my younger cousins being pressured to join. They were part of the new Germany, the generation that would grow up in a world where loyalty to the Führer was paramount. I couldn't understand it at first. I couldn't grasp how an entire generation could be molded so easily. My family was cautious. My mother in particular warned me to keep my head down, to not get involved in politics. But I knew just as well as anyone else that the situation was more dangerous than we realized. Not getting involved didn't feel like an option anymore. Not when the air was so thick with tension. Then came the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when Hitler purged his political rivals, including members of his own party. The SA, which had helped him rise to power, was seen as a threat, and they were ruthlessly eradicated. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, took their place, and with it, the iron grip of the Nazi regime tightened. There was no more room for disagreement, no room for anything but allegiance to Hitler. I remember that summer. The heat in the air was oppressive, and the sense of fear was everywhere. Neighbors whispered about the Gestapo, the secret police who were now everywhere, watching, listening. No one felt safe. People who had once been vocal about their political views now kept quiet. I heard of more disappearances, political opponents, the Jewish community, even those who simply expressed doubt, those who didn't fully embrace the new Germany, were being erased from existence, erased from memory. The Nuremberg laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of their citizenship, were passed with little opposition. I watched the Berlin Olympics in 1936, with the rest of the world admiring the spectacle, unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. It all felt so surreal. The games were meant to show the world the strength of the Third Reich, but for those of us living in it, it was a chilling reminder of the power we had lost. That evening, in 1938, I witnessed the beginning of Kristallnacht,
the night of broken glass. The glass, of course, wasn't just shattered windows. It was the final, open act of violence and hatred against the Jewish population. I remember walking through the streets the next morning, seeing the remnants of burned synagogues, smashed storefronts, and the smell of smoke still hanging in the air. The streets were quiet now. There was no relief from the tension, no one to speak out against the atrocities that had unfolded the night before. By 1939, I was an adult, and I could feel the weight of what had happened to Germany, what had happened to my country. In the space of just a few years, we had gone from a nation divided and broken to one ruled by fear and violence. My childhood had been marked by hope and despair, but the future seemed so much darker now. The country was on the brink of something terrible, and the war, World War II, was already looming on the horizon. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 would be the spark that set the world ablaze. I wish I could say that I knew where all of this would lead, but I didn't. All I knew was that we were living in a time of transformation, and with every passing day it was harder to see where we were headed or what we were losing in the process.
By the time the 1936 Berlin Olympics arrived, the Nazi regime had already cemented its hold on Germany. The eyes of the world were upon us, and Hitler made sure that the occasion would be a spectacle, one that portrayed an image of a strong, unified nation. It was a lie, of course, but it was a convincing one. I watched in awe as the athletes paraded through the streets, the Olympic flame burning brightly. The cheers were deafening, the flags fluttering in the summer breeze. Yet beneath the facade, the darkness was growing. I didn't know it at the time, but the world was watching us with a mix of curiosity, admiration, and fear. Hitler, Himmler, Göring, and the others were carefully constructing a narrative that painted the regime as the savior of Germany. They wanted the world to see Germany as powerful, vibrant, and ready to reclaim its place at the top. The world for the moment seemed willing to buy the story. At the same time, though, I began to notice more and more changes in the air. The Nuremberg laws had stripped Jews of their citizenship, and every day I saw the results of that decree. It wasn't just the anti-Semitic laws, it was the atmosphere that had shifted. People who had been part of our lives, our community, were suddenly no longer there. I heard whispers of businesses being seized, of families being forced to leave their homes. Friends were gone, and I couldn't understand how this had all happened so quickly. The SS, with its ominous presence, continued to grow in power. Heinrich Himmler's shadow seemed to stretch across every part of German life, from the police to the education system to the military. The Gestapo, the secret police, were everywhere, making sure that everyone stayed in line. Surveillance was no longer something abstract, something we read about in books. It was a reality. The state had eyes everywhere, and anyone who dared to speak against it faced unimaginable consequences. I remember one evening in 1938 when I was walking home and passed the town square. I noticed something strange. Jews were being dragged through the streets, their faces covered in bruises, their clothes torn. A group of SA men stood nearby, laughing. I didn't understand then. I thought it was an isolated incident, a random act of violence, but it wasn't. It was part of something much bigger, something far more sinister. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, came soon after. The streets were filled with broken glass, the remnants of destroyed synagogues and Jewish businesses. I could see the smoke rising from the rubble as I passed by, and my heart sank. The night was full of terror. I remember the fear on the faces of my Jewish classmates, the whispers in the hallways at school. I saw a friend, David, who had been my classmate for years, being led away by the SS, his face white with terror. His family was taken to a concentration camp, and I never saw him again. The silence that followed was deafening. People stopped talking. The city seemed to hold its breath, and I could feel the grip of fear tightening around us all. In the aftermath, the world did nothing. The international community turned its eyes away, as it often did, too hesitant to confront the monster that was growing in the heart of Europe. I could feel the impending war hanging over us like a storm cloud. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. The Munich Agreement in 1938 was a pivotal moment. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, stood in front of the crowd in London, holding a piece of paper and declaring that he had achieved peace for our time. I watched the newsreels, the propaganda showing Hitler shaking hands with European leaders, and I felt something deep in my gut twist. It was a lie, a betrayal, but we were too deep in the throes of national pride to see it for what it truly was. The world was appeasing Hitler, hoping that he would be satisfied with the Sudetenland. But we, the people of Germany, were swept up in the propaganda. The promise of a strong, powerful Germany made us feel proud again, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the atrocities happening right under our noses. As we neared the end of 1938, I began to feel the tension mounting. The everyday terror had become a permanent feature of life, like a background hum that you couldn't escape. Neighbors disappeared overnight, and no one asked where they went. Some of us whispered about concentration camps, about the places where the regime sent its undesirables. The fear of being labeled an enemy of the state, the fear of being dragged away in the middle of the night loomed over us all. I remember seeing a poster in the city, a call to join the Hitler Youth, the organization that was turning an entire generation into loyal Nazis. It was the first time I'd felt pressure to conform. The youth were being molded into soldiers of the regime, brainwashed to embrace the Führer and follow him blindly. My friends began to join. They spoke about nationalism, about Germany's rise to power, and it was hard to resist the pressure. But I knew something was terribly wrong. I had seen too much, heard too much to believe in the vision they were selling. Then, in 1939, the war finally came. Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1st was the trigger, and Europe was plunged into the second global conflict in a generation. We had seen it coming, but I don't think anyone was prepared for it. It felt like the inevitable conclusion of everything that had happened since 1919, this slow, steady slide into madness. I was now an adult, and the country I had grown up in had been transformed. We had witnessed the rise of a dictator, the erosion of freedom, and the systematic elimination of those who didn't conform to the regime. As the war began, there was a sickening realization that we were all complicit in it, even those of us who tried to stay silent. The world was changing, and it felt like Germany had given up its soul to march into the darkness. I look back now at the life I once knew, and I wonder how we got here. Where did we lose ourselves? How did a country that had once been filled with culture, with hope, descend into the abyss? Perhaps we all had a part to play in it. Maybe we all turned a blind eye to the growing shadows. Or maybe in the end, we were just too afraid to stop it. By the summer of 1936, it seemed that Germany was entering a strange period of both opulence and oppression. The Nazi regime had firmly taken root, but it was still wrapping the country in a sense of pride and accomplishment that masked the horrors lurking beneath the surface. For the first time, we saw material improvements. The economy, though still fragile, began to recover. Unemployment dropped dramatically, and the construction of autobahns and other infrastructure projects gave the impression of a nation moving forward. We all felt it, this uneasy tension between the illusion of prosperity and the reality of control. On the surface, things looked better. I could see the streets filled with people once more, working, laughing, and even dancing to the radio broadcasts that played the latest Nazi propaganda and swing music. The government promised a future full of national pride and glory, and on some level, I began to believe it myself. The Berlin Olympics that year only added to the veneer of national unity. The world watched as Jesse Owens, the African-American track and field athlete, humiliated the Nazi regime by winning 4 gold medals despite their claims of Aryan superiority. Hitler, infuriated by Owens' victories, left the stadium during the final race, but the spectacle went on. The Nazis used the Olympics as an opportunity to showcase their version of a unified, powerful Germany to the world. The streets were lined with flags, and there was a sense of nationalism that filled the air like a drug. The tension, though, remained. You could feel it even in the pride of the crowds, the sense that everything was being carefully orchestrated, designed to create an image of Germany that was far from the truth. The reality was much darker. Behind the sparkling facade of the Olympics and the construction of shiny new roads lay the continued persecution of political dissidents, intellectuals, and especially the Jewish population. I saw the increasing presence of SS officers patrolling the streets, their eyes scanning the crowd for anyone who looked suspicious. The Gestapo were always watching, always listening. Even though the Nuremberg laws had already stripped Jews of their citizenship in 1935, the full force of their impact hadn't hit yet. The tightening grip on the Jewish population was becoming clearer. I began to hear rumors about what was happening in places like Dachau, the first concentration camp, and about how the regime was systematically removing anyone they deemed undesirable. At the time, these stories were brushed aside, but I couldn't ignore the growing number of disappearances. People simply vanished, neighbors, acquaintances, even teachers, without a trace. There was no explanation, just a heavy silence that followed their absence. In 1938, the Kristallnacht pogrom occurred, and I remember that night as vividly as I remember my own name. The streets seemed to hum with the tension of something terrible about to unfold. As the evening wore on, I watched in horror as Nazi thugs with their brown shirts and black boots rampaged through the streets. They smashed windows, set fire to synagogues, and destroyed Jewish businesses. I knew some of the people whose stores were attacked. I saw their tears as they tried to stop the destruction. The night was a blur of violence, and the next morning the city was covered in glass. Kristallnacht, they called it, the night of broken glass. I had never seen anything like it before. The air was thick with smoke and fear. People I had known for years, people I had shared meals with, were now being carted away by the SS. And yet most of the city remained silent. It was as if we were all complicit in this nightmare, watching it unfold without protest. No one spoke out. I wanted to, but my fear was overwhelming. The regime's power was growing with each passing day, and with it, the realization that speaking out could cost me my life. Everyone was watching each other, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. By the time 1939 rolled around, things were clearer, though no less terrifying. The war was imminent. Hitler's rhetoric had already set the stage, and Poland had become his target. The Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938 was just the first step, and we all knew that Poland was next. The news spread through the city like wildfire, and I could see the fear in the eyes of those around me. The country had been slowly preparing for war, and now it seemed inevitable. I remember seeing German soldiers marching through Berlin, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed straight ahead. There was a sense of unease in the air, a sense of impending doom. I could feel it deep in my bones. This wasn't just about the glory of Germany. This wasn't just about national pride. This was about the annihilation of anyone who didn't fit into Hitler's vision of the future. But the propaganda machine had done its job. The streets were still full of people waving flags, chanting slogans, and singing the Horst Wessel song. There were those who genuinely believed that Germany would triumph, that this war was necessary to restore the nation's former greatness. But for many of us, the reality was beginning to sink in. The SS and Gestapo were tightening their grip on every part of life. It felt like living in a pressure cooker where every word you spoke, every glance you made, could be used against you. The day Poland was invaded, I sat in my apartment, watching the news on the radio. The announcement felt like a drumbeat, a loud, thunderous sound that reverberated through my bones. It was clear now, war had come. Germany was stepping into the world stage, and this time it was not as the underdog, but as an aggressor. I knew what this meant. I knew what would happen next. I could feel the eyes of my family and friends upon me, watching my reaction, waiting for me to say something. But what was there to say? The Third Reich had already consumed us. It had consumed everything, our culture, our freedom, our very humanity. I could feel the walls closing in, and though the war had only just begun, it felt like the beginning of the end. As I sit here today, looking back on those years, I wonder, where did it all go wrong? How did we, a country of thinkers, artists, and dreamers, descend into this madness? How did we lose ourselves to the fevered promises of power and nationalism? I can't say. All I know is that in those years, especially in the lead up to the war, I had a sinking feeling that everything we had built, everything I had known, was about to be torn apart. The days leading up to September 1st, 1939, were full of an eerie kind of silence. Berlin seemed to hold its breath, as if the whole world was waiting for something terrible to happen. I could feel the weight of the moment in the air. Everything felt so fragile. The rhetoric had been building for months, even years, and now the moment had arrived. Germany invaded Poland. I was at home, sitting by the window, when the announcement came through the radio. Hitler's voice, as smooth and forceful as ever, declared that the war had begun. The sound of his words, the Führer's voice, echoed in my mind long after the broadcast ended. It was strange.
While the world outside was celebrating, there was a nagging feeling in my gut, a sense that this wasn't the path we should have taken. The Nazis had painted this as a necessary step, a fight for survival, for the glory of Germany. But it felt like a step towards something far darker, something we couldn't undo.
In the days that followed, Berlin became a city on edge. People went about their business, but there was an undercurrent of tension. We knew the war was here, but it was still hard to fully grasp what that meant. I watched as men in uniforms filled the streets, marching with purpose, ready for battle. It was difficult to believe that only a few years earlier I had seen the same faces at cafes and on street corners. People now turned into soldiers, going off to fight in a war they likely didn't fully understand either. I could see the excitement in the eyes of those who believed in Hitler's vision, in the new Germany he had promised. For them, this war was something to celebrate, a way to restore pride to the nation. I remember hearing conversations at work about how the world would tremble before the might of Germany's military. But I also saw the fear in the eyes of those who had lived through the last war, the old men who knew all too well what this kind of conflict meant. For them, the war was not a victory waiting to happen. It was an impending disaster, one they had already seen up close. At first, there were no immediate signs of the horrors to come. The blitzkrieg tactics, so efficiently executed, took us by surprise. Poland fell swiftly as the Nazi forces tore through the country, and we saw victory after victory on the front lines. I heard the reports of Germany's success on the radio, and the city seemed to rejoice at first, cheers and celebrations in the streets. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of what was happening was too heavy to ignore. We were being swept up in the nationalist fervor, the crowds chanting and waving their flags. But behind that, there was a nagging sense of inevitability, the realization that this was just the beginning of something much darker. Then the war spread. France fell quickly, and the blitzkrieg continued across Europe. It was like watching a train derail in slow motion. Each victory, each march across another border was met with increasing national pride, but my sense of dread grew with each passing day. By 1940, there was talk of a victory parade in Berlin, of Germany's dominance over Europe. Hitler stood at the head of it all, looking at the world through a lens of conquest and violence. But we were also starting to hear stories from the front lines, rumors mostly, but it was impossible to ignore them. Concentration camps were being built at an alarming rate. At first, they were for political prisoners, for those who opposed the regime. But then, I started hearing whispers of mass arrests, of entire families being rounded up and sent to the camps. The whispers of something called the final solution began to emerge, though no one really knew what that meant, or at least no one who dared to speak up was willing to say anything out loud. Even as Germany's military advanced, even as we secured victories on the battlefield, there was a dark undercurrent that most people were too afraid to talk about. People were disappearing, neighbors, friends. I remember one evening, a knock at the door, an officer from the Gestapo asking about the whereabouts of a friend who had been critical of the regime. I didn't know where he was. He had disappeared in the night. But the fear that gripped my heart that evening was palpable. The Gestapo left without a word, but their presence was enough to
keep us all silent. In this new world, silence was survival. As 1941 approached, things became even more unsettling. The radio was filled with updates about the progress of the war, about how Germany was invading the Soviet Union in the East. The news was filtered, polished to fit the narrative we were supposed to believe, but I could feel something shifting. This wasn't just about reclaiming land. This wasn't about Germany's greatness anymore. This war had become something else entirely, something monstrous. But we were already too deep. By then, the majority of the country had either fallen into lockstep with the regime or had been too terrified to speak out. I looked around at the people in my life, at the streets I had walked on for years, and wondered, how did we get here? How had we lost ourselves to this machine of hatred and violence? The sense of complicity was suffocating, but there was no turning back. To speak out now would be to invite the same terror that had fallen upon those who had vanished without a trace. In 1941, as the war escalated, Germany's control over Europe tightened. The concentration camps became more than just places of detention. They became centers of unimaginable suffering and death. But no one spoke of it openly. The propaganda continued to flow, the images of a strong Germany and a unified Volk still plastered on posters and billboards. It was a twisted kind of patriotism, one that demanded complete loyalty and silence. The war didn't stop. It just spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. I had barely begun to process the shock of Poland falling when the rest of Europe seemed to collapse under the weight of Nazi ambition. France, the mighty fortress of the West, crumbled under the Blitzkrieg, and within months, Germany was in control of almost all of Europe. The United Kingdom still held out, but I could feel the tide of history shifting, carrying us along with it. But it wasn't just the military victories that kept me awake at night. No, it was the stories, the whispers that started to circulate little by little, the rumors that were no longer so easily ignored. Concentration camps, now turned into death camps, were expanding across Europe. People were disappearing, people I had known. It wasn't just the political dissidents, the Jews or the communists anymore. The purge had reached even the most ordinary of people, who were now seen as enemies simply for questioning the regime, even in the most private of settings. I remember my shock when I first heard about the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa. It was an unprecedented move, a war on two fronts, and no one quite understood the full consequences of what that meant. But there was no room for questions in the new Germany. People said it was necessary, that we had to destroy communism at its source, that the Lebensraum, living space in the East, was vital for the future of the German people. But those were just words. The reality on the ground was far more brutal. I remember the first reports of the mass executions in the East, the mass shootings of Jews and other undesirables. The stories were vague at first, only whispers, barely audible, but eventually the truth became clear. The Einsatzgruppen, the death squads, were operating in the occupied territories, systematically rounding up Jews, Roma, communists, anyone deemed undesirable by the Nazi ideology, and executing them in cold blood. No one in Berlin spoke of it openly, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease in the streets. The air was thick with silence. We all knew something terrible was happening,
but who dared to ask the questions? It was during this time that I began to see a deeper division within Germany. It wasn't just the obvious divides between the regime and those who opposed it, but within families, within communities. There were those who had fallen fully in line, those who were swept up by the promises of a glorious new Germany, and there were those like me, people who didn't fully support the regime, but who also feared the consequences of speaking out. The war had not only shattered Europe, but it had also shattered our country from the inside out. People were disappearing, and it wasn't just the Jews anymore. It was anyone who spoke out, anyone who resisted in the slightest way. The regime had become an all-encompassing force, and even the smallest act of defiance could lead to death. The more I saw, the more I realized that Germany, the Germany I had known, was no more. It had been consumed by the Nazis, twisted beyond recognition. The streets of Berlin, which had once been filled with laughter, now seemed suffocated by the constant presence of the SS, the Gestapo, and the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors who turned on one another. My family, the quiet, ordinary people who had just tried to get by, was now torn between fear and silence. One night I returned home late from work, my heart racing as I approached our building. I had heard rumors earlier that day. A friend of mine had been arrested for simply questioning the government. He had spoken out in a cafe, just as we had always done before. He was taken away that night without warning, and no one knew where he was now. No one dared ask. That night, I passed through the front door of our building and found my mother waiting for me, her face pale, her eyes red. I could see the weight of the fear on her face. I could feel it in my own bones. She had heard the rumors too. Neighbors were starting to disappear one by one, and there was no safe place to hide anymore. The pressure was mounting. People began whispering about the resistance movements, but the White Rose Group, the most well-known of them, was already disbanded by 1942, its members executed for the most insignificant acts of defiance. I had heard about them, the students at Munich University who dared to print anti-Nazi pamphlets and leave them in public spaces. Their courage haunted me, but it also terrified me. I couldn't bring myself to speak their names. They were martyrs to a cause I felt powerless to affect. I began to understand that the fight for Germany's soul was over. The people who stood against the Nazis were either dead or too afraid to speak. It seemed that the rest of the country had either accepted the new reality or was too afraid to do anything about it. The regime had won, and I felt it deep in my chest. It wasn't a single battle. It was the slow, insidious takeover of a country, the erosion of everything that had once made Germany a proud and intellectual nation. What had happened to our culture, our humanity? The years of Nazi rule had made it clear nothing would ever be the same again. The war, the violence, the brutality, it was all connected. And I, like so many others, was living in it, trapped by the silence we had all chosen to adopt. As the war continued, the echoes of its violence reached further into our lives. I could see the toll it had taken on my family, on my friends, on myself. We were living in a prison, but it wasn't just the walls that held us in. It was the fear, the constant threat of death, of disappearance, and of betrayal. And yet life went on. The war didn't stop for our fear, for our pain. The bombs continued to fall. The the soldiers continued to march, and we continued to live under the regime's heavy hand. It felt like a nightmare from which we could never wake. By 1942, the war had reached every corner of Germany, and the home front was no longer untouched. I remember the sound of bombers in the night, the distant rumbles of explosions as cities were torn apart. It felt like the country was suffocating under the weight of the war. Berlin, once a vibrant center of culture and progress, was now a shell of its former self, under constant threat of Allied air raids. The streets I had once walked with ease were now marked by the dark scars of war, crumbled buildings, shattered windows, and the hollow faces of those who had lost everything. Every day I watched people I knew, ordinary men and women, change. They became either fiercely loyal to the regime or deeply fearful of what might happen if they didn't comply. The war had consumed all of us, even if we were just bystanders, just the silent majority. The tension was palpable, the fear was everywhere. Propaganda plastered the walls, urging the citizens to keep fighting, to remain loyal. But behind the banners and slogans, the cracks in the regime's control were beginning to show. There were whispers, small acts of resistance, though they were growing fewer and fewer. But the war was not something we could escape. It touched everyone. Even those of us who hadn't yet been drafted were affected. My friends, my family, even acquaintances, everyone had someone they knew at the front. The streets were full of young men in uniform, their faces blank and distant, many of them wearing the same expression I had seen in my father's eyes after the last war. They had come back from the front, shattered, only to find a Germany at war again. At home, life became a constant balancing act. We lived in fear of the Gestapo, the ever-watchful secret police, and the SS, whose presence was growing. Neighbors became informants. The streets were filled with whispers. "Have you heard? So-and-so was taken last night, disappeared without a trace." People no longer spoke freely in the open. Conversations were whispered behind closed doors. Some families had already been marked, their fates sealed by associations, by their political views, or simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. No one was safe. The air raids grew worse, and the nights grew longer. The familiar sounds of siren wails and the crash of bombs became a regular part of our lives. People I had known for years were now living in shelters, forced to huddle together in fear, praying that each raid would pass without taking their homes, their lives. There was a strange numbness that set in. I had learned to sleep through the air raids, to endure the deafening noise of falling bombs. I began to realize that we were no longer just fighting a war abroad. We were fighting it on our very doorstep. The war had become our everyday reality. But the greatest horror of those years for me wasn't just the bombs or the soldiers marching off to the front. It was the way the Nazi regime had penetrated every aspect of life, how it turned even the most ordinary actions into something that could betray you. I began to see people disappear, not because they were sent to the front lines, but because they were arrested for speaking out, for having the wrong thoughts, for being suspected of dissent. I remember a young man, a friend of mine, who had once been full of fire and optimism, who had joined the Hitler Youth when he was just a boy. He had been eager to serve the Führer, to fight for Germany's honor. But I saw him change over time as he began to realize what was happening in the camps, what the regime was truly doing. He became quieter, withdrawn. One evening I saw him slip into the resistance, secretly passing information about the movements of Nazi soldiers. I never saw him again after that night. His family was told that he had been caught and executed for treason. His disappearance, like so many others, was simply another dark chapter in the ever-expanding history of fear. It was around this time that I noticed the increasing number of Jewish families who had been forced out of their homes. Deportations were happening more frequently, the trains rolling out to the east, taking the Jews to their fate. I had once lived next to a Jewish family, a kind and gentle family who had shared their lives with us. I saw them one last time just before they were taken. I remember their faces as they stood in front of their building, their belongings packed hastily in bags, looking around as if they couldn't quite believe what was happening to them. They were never heard from again. I tried to ignore the whispers, the rumors about the death camps, but they were impossible to escape. The news spread from person to person, each version more horrific than the last. No one spoke of it aloud, but the knowledge of what was happening in places like Auschwitz and Treblinka became a silent truth that we all had to carry. No one knew how many lives had been lost in those camps, but everyone knew it was unimaginable. By 1944, Germany was beginning to feel the weight of the war turning against us. The Allies were closing in. The D-Day invasion had taken place, and the Soviet forces were pushing from the east. Berlin felt more isolated than ever. I could feel the panic setting in. The regime, once so sure of itself, was now crumbling under the pressure of the war and the unrelenting assault on its territory. The once proud banners that filled the streets of Berlin were now hanging in tatters. The signs of defeat were all around us, but the Nazi propaganda machine refused to acknowledge it. Instead, it pushed forward, clinging to the idea that victory was still within our reach, even as the walls of the Reich crumbled around us. I could see it in the faces of the soldiers who returned from the front lines, those few who survived. They came back broken, their eyes hollow with the horror they had seen, carrying the weight of the war on their shoulders. They had witnessed things that no one should ever see, and many of them returned not as soldiers, but as ghosts. By 1944, it was clear to anyone who had been paying attention that Germany was losing the war. The once proud Nazi banners that lined the streets of Berlin were now tattered and ragged. The Allies had landed in France, and the Soviets were pushing relentlessly from the east. Berlin was surrounded on all sides, and the air raids that had been a constant for years now seemed to intensify. The streets that had once been full of life, of victory and pride, were now dark and empty, save for the soldiers who still walked the streets, their faces hard and desperate. The war had entered its final stages, and with each passing day, the certainty of defeat grew more apparent. I remember the sound of the air raid sirens becoming a constant part of our lives. People didn't even react to them anymore. It had become normal to rush to the shelters, to huddle together in the dark, waiting for the explosions to stop. The bombs came every night, sometimes in the middle of the day, but the people of Berlin had already grown numb to them. We knew the end was near. I recall hearing about the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944, led by a group of German officers who had finally realized what the regime had become. The plot was foiled,
and the response was swift and brutal. Hundreds of people were executed for their involvement, and their families were destroyed. The Nazi regime was desperate now, holding on to whatever power it had left, using fear and violence to try to maintain control. But it was too late. The collapse of the Nazi state had begun, and with it, the final horrors of war. The SS had become even more brutal in its enforcement of the regime's policies, and the Gestapo were everywhere, rounding up anyone suspected of opposition, of dissent. People who had once walked the streets freely now looked over their shoulders, afraid of who might be listening. Families were torn apart, neighbors reported one another, and the fear of betrayal was everywhere. You couldn't trust anyone. The lines between loyalty and survival had blurred beyond recognition.
My family lived in constant fear. The Gestapo had already paid a visit to a neighbor of ours, a family who had spoken against the regime in private. Their house had been ransacked, and their son, a young boy of just 18, had been taken. No one knew what happened to him, but we all knew that when the Gestapo took someone, they didn't come back. It was this that haunted me in those final months. Could it happen to me? Could it happen to anyone? It didn't matter who you were anymore. The Reich's eyes were everywhere, and to defy it, to even question it, meant you vanished into thin air. As the war raged on, the Nazi regime's control began to fray. Berlin was no longer the shining city of power and propaganda. It had become a dark and decaying shell of its former self. Hitler, who had once inspired millions, now seemed like a broken man. I heard rumors, perhaps they were only rumors, that he had become more erratic, more unstable as the losses mounted. I never saw him in person, but the fear that his ideology had bred was visible in every corner of the city. We were all prisoners now, bound not by walls, but by a force even more insidious, the fear of retribution. By the spring of 1945, the Allies had pushed through France and were moving rapidly through Germany. The Soviet forces had reached the outskirts of Berlin, and the final assault on the capital city was imminent. I remember standing in the streets one evening, looking up at the sky, which seemed filled with the distant sound of artillery and the roar of tanks. The once great capital, the seat of power, was now under siege from all sides. The streets were filled with refugees, fleeing from the advancing armies, but many of them were simply running into the heart of the destruction, into the very maw of the beast. The Nazis had issued orders to defend the city at all costs. I watched as desperate Volkssturm soldiers, barely trained and armed with outdated weapons, were thrown into the line of fire. They were young boys, old men, and anyone who could hold a rifle. They were expected to fight for a lost cause, and their bravery was overshadowed by the futility of it all. In those last weeks, as the bombs fell around us and the Soviet forces advanced, I couldn't help but wonder if it was even possible to return to any kind of normality after all this. The damage was irreversible. The country was shattered, and the ideals that had once seemed so grand, the vision of a great, powerful Germany, had been destroyed by the very man who had promised to restore it. I remember the day the Soviets finally entered Berlin. It was a day of chaos and destruction. The city had already been reduced to rubble, but the final days were filled with scenes of madness. I saw families trying to flee, but the roads were blocked, the skies filled with the sounds of gunfire and bombs. The final battle for Berlin was relentless. House by house, street by street, building by building. We were caught in the middle of it all, civilians who had never wanted any part of this madness, now trying to survive. Then came the announcement: Hitler had died. Whether by suicide or something else, the details didn't matter anymore. The man who had brought Germany to the brink of annihilation was gone, but his legacy, his ideology, remained, and it had already done its damage. The war would end shortly after, with the unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945. The night the war officially ended, I stood in the middle of the city, staring at the ruins. The streets were silent for the first time in years. The constant hum of war had stopped, but in its place was something worse: the absolute silence of a country shattered beyond repair. I could see the ghost of Berlin, the city that had once been alive with culture, with ideas, with hope, now lying in ruins.